All right. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon if you're in another part of the world. Welcome to the fourth day of the USSEE 2022 conference. We've had some excellent discussions over the course of this week, including several plenaries and lots of good paper presentations. I've been looking forward to this day. We organized a panel broadly on the topic of the future of ecological economics, and we thought who better than some scholars starting their careers in ecological economics to tell us about the future from their perspectives, because they will be leading that future in ecological economics. So I am very pleased to join this group this morning. I'm Robbie Richardson. I'm a professor at Michigan State University and past president of the U.S. Society for Ecological Economics. And I will be joined by Rigo Melgar, PhD candidate at the University of Vermont. Also, Shaun Sellers, PhD candidate at McGill University, and Nina Smolyar, PhD candidate at University of Vermont. And we have organized what we hope will be a compelling panel discussion. We're going to begin with some questions that I've prepared to ask of this group. And then at some point we will pause and invite you all as members of the audience to either unmute yourselves or type something in the chat, or however you'd like to ask a question of this esteemed panel. So let's get started. I'm going to just go in alphabetical order, but I want to thank the panelists for being willing to join this discussion. I'm going to begin with a general question for each of you, giving you an opportunity to briefly introduce yourselves, including your research interests, and tell us how you first came to be interested in ecological economics. So Rigo, would you like to begin?
Sure thing. Thank you. Well, first of all, it is my pleasure to join you and to discuss the future of ecological economics. And to be with such phenomenal peers, such as Shaun and Nina, who I know care deeply about moving forward an ecological economics that is relevant for the social and ecological challenges and opportunities that we face. I am Rigo Melgar. I'm currently a PhD candidate working with Josh Parley and John Erickson to contribute to the knowledge creation and sharing of ecological economics at the University of Vermont and beyond. I'm also a graduate fellow at the Econ Institute and the Leadership for Decolonization. I would say that I have quite diverse research interests that converge in my deep interest to rethink economics by grounding it in its biophysical and social foundations so that it works for the well-being of people on the planet. Philosophically and morally, I believe that economics must be subservient to the needs of people and not the other way around, while respecting the biophysical realities and protecting the ecological foundation of our life. I think I have always had an inclination for understanding what are the root causes of our problems. And this led me to focus on learning about energy systems and biophysical economics during my undergraduate and graduate time at the State University of New York College of Environmental Science and Forestry. This led me ultimately to meet Dr. Charlie Hall, who is known for developing the concept of energy return on investment and the field of biophysical economics. For those not familiar with biophysical economics, it is defined as the study of the ways and means by which socioeconomic systems procure and use energy and other biological and physical non-renewable and renewable resources to produce, distribute, consume, exchange goods and services, while generating various wastes and environmental impacts. Charlie taught me about the biophysical foundation of the economy and opened the doors to develop a keen understanding of how real economies work, since socioeconomic systems are completely dependent on available energy to transform matter into the goods and services that enable well-being. Also, I may add that from the beginning, I was breaking the patterns of how you approach learning about economics. And as many of you might know, Steve Kim from Australia, he has recently pointed out to the Rethinking Economics crowd that economics students should be taking macroeconomics before they take microeconomics, which is the reverse of what conventional thinking recommends. And that's exactly what I did without me even knowing this more than 10 years ago. And biophysical economics focuses on the macro aspects of the economy. Charlie believed in me, just like John and Josh have, and that has definitely given me opportunities that to work on ecological economics. I'm extremely grateful for it. But yeah, this ultimately has led me to do a PhD in ecological economics, which someone like myself, first generation Latino college graduate, was extremely unlikely. But my passion for helping people and the environment led me to realize that the way economies are structured is at the root of the social and ecological problems that we face. So I'm gonna leave you with a quote from Odom that basically changed the way I think about all these issues. And he wrote in 1971 that when systems are considered in energy terms, some of the bewildering complexity of our world disappears. Situations of many types and sizes turn out to be special cases or relatively few basic types. Getting to realize this was life-changing for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Rigo. We're pleased you're here. Let's turn over to Shaun now.
Pardon me. Hi, everyone. Thank you as well for inviting me to be here with these folks. I'm Shaun Sellers. I'm a PhD candidate at McGill University in Montreal, though I come to you now from unceded Algonquin territory in Ontario. My PhD research is in socio-ecological trade theory for post-growth global economies. And the theory of change that I center my work on is in the foundational philosophies of institutions that structure our economies and our lives, which is sort of how I got into EE in the first place. I'd been really politically active as a young person, but I also felt like I hadn't seen a lot of effect because of the ways in which ecological outcomes seemed to always be considered an economic trade-off that usually favored financial markets instead of, the future livability of the planet. So I didn't really understand how to engage with this when I was younger. I didn't know where the leverage points were that were meaningful to me. And I didn't even have the language that I'm speaking about it now with. And I sort of disengaged with activism on a broader scale for many years. I eventually ended up finishing my BA in business management as a mature student in an effort to scale up a business I owned at the time, a fair trade and organic chocolate company that I started. But during my time finishing my studies, I had a couple of required courses that gave me time and space to focus on the intersection between economy and ecologies. And I was finally able to clarify what, for me and many others, of course, is the meaningful leverage point of the intersectional climate action, or rather that without shifting how we understand and study our economies, we are unlikely to be able to transform our shared provisioning systems away from sort of endlessly reproducing more climate change. So suddenly it seemed possible to work towards meaningful change. Just to be clear, I think there are a lot of ways to do activism and be working towards change in this sort of like pluralistic whole. This is just the framing that was meaningful for me. So instead of scaling up my business, I sold it. And I pursued a master's in ecological economics, and sort of everything fell into place finally for me. And I sort of thought, this is the intellectual home I have been waiting for and hoping to find, and was really excited to see that it already existed in a fairly robust and inspiring way by the time I got here. And yeah, that's how I could talk a lot more about it, but mine was a really personal journey. I mean, I guess it's all personal, but that's me.
Well, thank you, Shaun. We are glad you're here. Nina, how about over to you next?
Thank you so much. Hello, everybody. My name is Nina Smoliar. I'm a PhD student at University of Vermont in the Rubenstein School and affiliated with the Gund Institute. I apologize for my short absence there. I have a very aging computer and I decided to switch off right as we were beginning. So the question is how I got started in ecological economics, right? Is that correct?
Just an open-ended sort of introduce yourself, your interests, and how you came to be interested in ecological economics.
Of course. So my general research areas are decolonization and degrowth, as well as indigenous sovereignty and resurgence, land, power relations, participatory action research, still finding all kinds of interesting ways as options to narrow all that down. And I just wanted to offer like a short story about how I got interested in ecological economics. Certainly as a child, I was very much a kid who spent time in the woods and in nature. And so that naturally led me to being an environmentalist in general. And then when I got to college, I'm just generally interested in social justice and activism, I realized, okay, economics really runs the world. So if I want to make an impact, if I want to be able to contribute to shifting all of the intense suffering that's happening in this country and elsewhere, that I need to understand economics in general, because it's such a huge driving factor of what happens. And so I was sitting in the economics 101 in my freshman introductory course, and I'm listening to professor lecture 100 something students about externalities. And I remember thinking, what in the world is that concept? That makes absolutely no sense. External to where? There's no else to go. This is just one enclosed earth system. And so that was a seed I remember very clearly for my interest in ecological economics, even though I did not know the term or know that it existed at all. But that was planted, and eventually I found my way to UVM because it has a specialization in ecological economics, and very happy to be pursuing being able to contribute in this way.
Thank you. Well, Shaun, if I could turn back to you, you mentioned an interest in rethinking international trade through an ecological economics perspective. Trade is not something that figures prominently in a lot of discourse in ecological economics. So I think you're entering a really much needed gap. Could you elaborate on your thoughts on trade and how an ecological economics perspective informs that work?
Sure, of course, thanks. Yes, I agree that there hasn't been a lot of explicit conversation about trade, even though ecological economics studies trade, what seems to me sort of endlessly. A lot of the methodologies and tools that are used are studying trade, are studying environmentally extended input-output. And in my master's, I sort of said, what are we doing with all of this? What is its purpose? Where's our trade policy package for EE? And there were reasons that didn't exist, or it didn't exist in a sort of robust way. I mean, I've been inspired by a lot of the calls for relocalizing economies, for bringing bioregional economies into conversations, a lot of the Green New Deal proposals to create local economies as well. Or there's also translocal economies via campesina or fair trade. And there are lots of proposals about how to sort of do some of these within the EE literature, using green quantitative easing or using local currencies or through other forms of industrial policies. But a lot of these ideas for localizing and thus reducing the ecological footprint of our economies just really simply violate international trade law, which is some of the reasons that people didn't pursue them a lot, sort of like theoretically. And I was sort of, that wasn't enough to stop me, or I was interested in pursuing that still. And I think that, because there is a lot of, in terms of climate action, there's a lot of evidence that whenever sort of government bodies at whatever scale sort of attempt to make policies for climate or environmental reasons, they end up being challenged in the WTO appellate court or through ISDS, which is the investor state dispute settlement process, where they overwhelmingly lose and are forced to stop doing whatever climate action they're doing. So I don't think that it's something that we can not pay attention to. I think it's pretty clear from the IPCC reports and a lot of EE research that timely climate action requires government coordination and not just shifting some prices here and there within markets. And yet government action on climate is significantly constrained right now by global trade governance and the rules. So our global trade governance regime and its sort of assorted institutions like the WTO, whose rules are grounded in normative theories of growth through comparative advantage and preserving the global economy as the sort of singular theoretical global market without the hindrance of political borders in theoretical terms. So in my work, what I look at and what the research and normative positions in ecological economics would contribute to a social ecological theory of trade to ground post-growth trade governance institutions instead of a growth theory that we have now. There are enormous amounts of research in EE studying the ways that international trade as it is today leads to social inequalities, ecological degradation, sort of to say nothing of the macro level carbon emissions analysis. And the normative goals of EE being long-term well-being on a livable planet are really actually quite different from the normative goals of classical, neoclassical, or neoliberal forms of theory, which could be said to just be economic growth or efficiency. It's generally accepted even within mainstream trade policy spheres that current trade governance is a problem and is working against climate goals. So I'm looking at what kind of theory or narrative or story of trade is needed for a global economy that is not universally oriented towards growth and that allows for multiple scales of climate action or governance without merely being another form of protectionism and the sort of social and ecological troubles that like can bring with it. So one quick example with EE are boundaries and what borders are important. Ecological economics deals with lots of boundary considerations, planetary boundaries, regional ecological boundaries, social and ethical boundaries of well-being, because trade theory and international trade more generally is really about how value crosses borders and what that means, and does that change as it crosses borders. So this is pretty different from current theory, which not only rejects borders as political and therefore not a natural part of market theory, but considers the Earth to be a single space, a single system with no boundaries worth considering, to think nothing of socially constructed boundaries. But luckily, theories of trade are sort of generally applied consolidations of macroeconomic ideas and theories. And there's been a lot of new scholarship in ecological macroeconomics in the last years as more of ecological economics has become sort of less averse to developing its own theory and sort of stating that if we prefigure the economy as embedded in social relations and in the biosphere, that actually constitutes a distinct macroeconomic perspective, which is all to say that EE has all the components of a theory of trade. And I mean, I'm pretty excited to be working towards bringing it together and seeing what that narrative looks like, and that might hopefully be useful in working towards transforming our economies with all the other folks that are doing the same.
Well,
I can
thank
talk
you,
about it for a long time, but that's it.
No, it's very interesting. And I imagine that your interests are going to generate some questions with some participants in this session that I can see on the screen. But yeah, let's turn to Rigo. I understand that your work is focused on grounding monetary and financial systems in their social ecological foundations, and then their implication for a just energy transition in the US. How do you see these areas as related?
Yes, well, I've been very fortunate to be working with John Erickson and Josh Farley on this very important question, I think. But first, I think that what people need to understand is that money is a social claim on energy. Nothing happens without energy. Energy is defined as the ability to do work. In other words, money is worthless without energy. The socio-ecological implications of untethered monetary and financial systems of today that create money as interest-bearing debt out of nothing are dramatic because this dictates the rate at which we undermine our planetary boundaries and accelerate limits to growth. It also has fundamental implications for solving inequities when a financial system redirects investments away from society at large to what a few want, which ends up becoming a cost to society. I largely focus on this question in my second chapter, and I've been working for like almost 2 years on this to really understand, dig deep on what the US financial system and its global implications are, and focusing on the socio-ecological implications of financialization specifically, which is basically defined as when the financial system takes over every aspect of our lives, and all-purpose money ends up dictating everything that we do. And from an ecological economic perspective, financialization leads to unsustainable levels of resource extraction and resulting waste emissions, unjustly redistributes resources towards a new rentier class, and generates highly inefficient bubbles and busts that destabilize the economy. Consequently, the structure and current financial system prevents the economy from being at a sustainable scale, preventing the just distribution and efficient allocation of resources. People today are deeply worried about inflation, which will get worse. I write about this with increasing costs from climate change now and in the future, and if we don't shift away from fossil fuels, which we are depleting, especially cheap oil, we'll never run out of fossil fuels. There will always be fossil fuels. There's a lot of coal out there. There's a lot of oil and everything. But what matters is when you run out of cheap fossil, and that's what the energy return on investment aspect comes in, right? How much surplus can you get from what you invest? And so what that leads us to this need for energy transition, and it has to really be transformational, or we will find ourselves in trouble later on with inflation even worse than we see in today, as depletion of cheap oil and the cost from crossing planetary boundaries kicks in. It's been this is the 50th anniversary of Limits to Growth report by Donella Meadows et al. And it is worth pointing out that the only way the model was able to show a way out of the collapse that the model showed was by stabilizing investments. This reality has serious implications for an energy transition to a low carbon economy because there are substantial energetic and thus financial investments that have to be made while trying to stay within the global carbon budget to avoid crossing the 2 degrees Celsius temperature that scientists have been warning about. Interestingly, both the climate models and the limits to growth models show that we will be in trouble by the next couple of decades. So they kind of like coincide. So what economic model has been as nearly accurate as the limits to growth model? I don't know. However, all of these facts don't seem to matter to decision makers, as they seem to be paralyzed and unable to make the radical changes that we need. This presents tremendous obstacles to shifting towards an ecological economy. However, Donella Meadows once said, "The scarcest resource is not oil, metals, clean air, capital, labor, or technology. It is our willingness to listen to each other and learn from each other, and to seek the truth rather than to seek to be right." And I believe in this divisive context that we're in, this is more relevant than ever.
Wow, I agree. Fascinating. Nina, let's bring you back in. You mentioned your interests in Indigenous sovereignty. Could you tell us how critical perspectives of decolonization and Indigenous sovereignty have informed your approach to ecological economics?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I want to begin by acknowledging that the land where I live and work is traditional unceded Abenaki land, which comprises what settlers have named as Vermont and many of the surrounding New England states. And to the extent that there still exists disciplinary and philosophical separation between decolonization and ecological economics, I'm compelled to prioritize working directly on decolonization rather than ecological economics to an extent. So the general understanding of EE is that it's a discipline that began in the 80s or so as a conversation between American and European economists as a much needed response to the social and ecological destruction that the rapaciousness of capitalism fueled by neoclassical economic orthodoxy unleashed. Ecological economists began advocating for the reality that infinite growth is impossible on a finite planet, as we all know here very well. And if humanity is interested in its own survival as a species, this reality is a salient fact requiring substantial changes in the globally dominated economic system. So as we're familiar, EE flips the commonly held notion in mainstream economics and says that instead of the environment being an ongoing free supply of natural resources for extraction and throughput, in fact, the environment, the stocks, flows, and regeneration rates are all a biophysical limiting factor, not only for the human needs and economy, but also for the biophysical needs of all the species who live in and need the same environment. So this notion that's fundamental to EE that appeared as a theoretical innovation last century among Western academic circles actually is and has been the basis of indigenous cosmologies and traditional practices that had evolved over thousands of years, long before anything that we might now know as classical economics theory was articulated, arising out of European views. And these views were that humans are separate and entitled to dominate the rest of life on the planet, that other species do not warrant moral agency or spiritual existence. Success is defined in maximizing wealth, material property, and power, both for individuals and nation states. Reason and intellect are to be privileged above other dimensions of human experience. And that in this initial set of conditions co-produced oppressive social systems that are inherently necessary for capitalism to keep going. It cannot exist without control of land and people, and so it cannot exist without colonization and racism. And this is a control enacted by a systemic threat of violence or actual violence. These views were brought to and implemented in what now many of us now call North America, taking land by force, working to completely disappear people who were living on the territory, which erases their cultures, and imposing a vastly different economic and political system are all intertwined components of colonization writ large. And what was being erased included cultural values and practices that ecologically and justice-minded sectors of modern societies like the EE community that we aspire to live by now. And these values include to live in harmonious relationship with all of nature as a whole, with many interdependent beings, to whom humans owe respect, reciprocity, and accountability, which are the analytical endpoints, one might say, this is how I see it. These are endpoints of ecological economics praxis, but they have coexisted as indigenous cultures. And so the roots of the endpoints are actually indigenous life worlds themselves. And so what are the implications of this? Well, for one, colonization and capitalism were effective for a very long time in erasing indigenous knowledge from visibility and from legitimacy. And so now that Earth has been essentially on fire for half a century and illusions of modern progress are coming apart, separating various disciplines of knowledge is seen as a failure as far as, ecological economics and economists are concerned. So now anti-capitalist Western economists, we're now theorizing transition from potential species suicide and ecological collapse to collective thriving. But the worldviews and life ways of such very thriving have been around for millennia and survived through colonization and erasure enough to pulse through history to today. Indigenous views are distinct and having never bought into the reductionist linear thinking to prioritize growth and maximize material wealth at the expense of all else. They're distinct and embodied knowing that humans and environment are part of a complex system as a whole, and that anything that harms the environment will be directly harmful to humans and vice versa. So from this kind of framing, EE is essentially a response to the destructiveness of colonization, a response from within the colonizer's world, looking to solve the problems colonization created for everyone, not just the colonized, which is a fact that had delayed recognition. And the fact that EE's foundational principles have existed in theory and in practice as indigenous philosophies is another fact that is of delayed recognition. And there are further implications of all of this, of course. And I'll close now by saying that I approach EE by working to contribute to a meaningful relationship between EE and decolonization, which would need to include accurate, accountable, and reciprocal recognition, centering indigenous groups and their efforts that are aligned with ecological and just processes and outcomes towards effective coalition building and transitioning to a future where ecological and social well-being are the core practices of the human species. Thank you.
Wow, thank you. You know, I was in listening to the three of you, I was thinking about how some of my mentors, some of the early thinkers in ecological economics, if they could hear you today, I think they'd be very pleased with the diversity of your interests and the ways in which you come to ecological economics. I think they would find it very compelling. Shaun, if we could go back to you. You have a question in the chat that I'll read aloud. Jeff asks, I wonder if the term protectionism is too bound up in the underlying worldviews and epistemologies of conventional trade and globalization to be useful in a trade regime that's not growth insistent, overly committed to efficiency and et cetera. Is it a useful term to retain protectionism? Can it be adequately reformed to become a positive term that refers to things that are important to protect in a mutually enhancing human-earth relationship? What are your thoughts on that, Shaun?
So I will try and be brief because I feel like a lot could be said. I often use the term protectionism to speak to the older narrative, in which anything that is considered a restraint or a limitation on the flow of goods and services is called protectionism, regardless of its origin or intention. And at the same time, there is a lot of research into empirical research into the ways in which traditional forms of protectionism favor regimes that end up creating social inequality outcomes and sort of like increasing ecological degradation in the short term. So I am mostly actually quite playful with it when I use it to just sort of say, yeah, what if we protected something else instead of like corporations? Because that is generally what it is when states are engaging with protectionism. It's because they are, protecting a certain domestic industry or something like that. And with very specific sort of like corrupt pathways to why they are protecting it. It's not the only way to do it, but so I use it as a way to speak to the old narrative. I have pretty much no intention of using it going forward because I agree that protection is a fairly, even if we use it as protecting mutually beneficial relationships, if we use it to say we're protecting ecologies, there's still quite a paternalistic and recentering of the human and what our theoretical like power actually is. So if we're actually trying to sort of like decenter the human as the like dominant life form on the planet, us protecting stuff is maybe not the right language. You're totally right, Jeff. And you probably won't hear me use that language unless I'm talking to people who really believe in protectionism. And I'm trying to be like, yeah, what if we did this other form of protectionism? What if you thought about things differently as sort of a step down the path? But yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, really, really good question, Jeff. Let me just pose a question to anyone who feels compelled to answer. I imagine that some participants in this room may not be familiar with the Leadership for the Ecozoic initiative. And so would one of you or several of you like to describe the mission of the initiative? It's evolved a little bit over the years since the initial initiative, but ultimately, you know, elaborate on your collaboration to reform higher education and ecological economics. I think we'd like to hear a little bit about that. Nina, you look like you're just about to launch
I was waiting for Rigo to launch, but I can initiate a launch as well. Well, generally the term ecozoic, as I've learned, actually from John Erickson, who is the person that I was fortunate enough to meet in my pursuit of ecological economics and end up being in this program. The term ecozoic comes from Wendell Berry and or is it Thomas Berry? Oh my God, well, that is embarrassing. All right, well, one of the very prolific writers whose last name is Berry, and it means a time when humanity and, thank you, Thomas, a time when humanity and the environment will be in a harmonious relationship. In a sense, the implication from this particular scholar's work is that it'll be something that's going to happen in the future as if it's something that hadn't been happening before. And as my comments would imply that had been the case before in parts of the world and in other times. So essentially it's an academic program where the theory of change is to train PhD students and have people enter different positions in society to try to shift the various systems where we might be embedded later on after we finish, to shift those systems towards being aligned with practices and structures and narratives and general like cultural values to be going towards a harmonious relationship. So I'll close there with my launch.
Well, it's a very interesting initiative. I mean, you all represent two institutions of higher education, which is partly how you all know each other. So how does that work in practice? I mean, how is a multi-institution initiative with this kind of mission carried out? I mean, I like the terminology so much because it's very hopeful. Where I think many of us tend to think a lot about planetary limits and boundaries, which is fine, but the ecozoic as a hopeful outcome, I think, is something we need leadership for. How does this work in practice?
I could go. Basically, this is an international, like you said, it's an international project, not just between McGill University and UVM, and hoping to expand moving forward. But yeah, it is pretty complicated. I think John and Peter Brown took on a little more than 4 years ago on a big task when they started this, and it was a big risk, I think, to try to find a way to collaborate using a lot of Zoom, for example, for required courses at the beginning of our program. But I think ultimately has been worthwhile to be able to not only have this opportunity to get funded, because all of this, by the way, shocking, right? It requires funding to be able to study and to be doing what we do, which we're very grateful for. But yeah, just all the connections that we have made, meeting out, just knowing that there's other people out there who care about these issues just as I do, means the world to me. And I think that, yeah, we're working as much as we can with the means that we have to collaborate and to integrate our thinking in the best way possible. There is a lot of still roadblocks, that get in the way, but we're working towards it. And yeah.
Great. Well, Rigo, while you have the floor, I thought to ask you about the Ecological Economics for All initiative. How are you working to make ecological economics more accessible and overcoming barriers in academia and translating the theory of ecological economics into action? What are you aiming to do there?
So basically, the idea for ecological economics for all came about maybe like in 2020, in the middle of the pandemic, which many of us, you know, everyone has gone through, and thankfully made it out of it. But it was very difficult time, and I was trying to like focus my energy into something that would be positive. So I thought, you know, we need to, and coming into this program 4 years ago, I told John the first time I met with him on Zoom, that my interest in ecological economics was to not just, you know, I love academic exercises and I love research and all of that, but how do we actually translate, right? All this theory, a lot of this awesome theory that has been developed for the past 30 plus years, formally 30 years, but, you know, since for a long time. And that got me thinking, we gotta rethink the way we are creating and sharing information to move, because for example, if economic departments in most of the country in the United States around the world don't want to teach about ecological economics, I believe we have to find a way around that, and to be able to plant the seeds for people to carry on the vision of ecological economics and to act on it. And ecological economics for all is an emergent initiative inspired by the Leadership for the Ecozoic, dedicated to promote a socio-ecological paradigm shift in economics to enable a just sustainability transition to a right-sized economy. The mission of Ecological Economics for All is to make the knowledge of ecological economics and allied fields, heterodox economic fields, available to everyone who wishes to use it to promote economic transformation that foster genuine and inclusive well-being through ecologically sustainable and equitable societies. Ecological Economics for All aims to achieve its mission by facilitating educational, collaborative, and policy initiatives, such as this summer crash course on ecological economics that we have been planning here at UVM, that now has more than 700 people registered for it, by the way. And it is, like John would say, a multiplier effect, what we're trying to do here. We're trying to get anyone who wants to learn how a better way. You know, I believe ecological economics has an amazing story to tell, and that story cannot be confined to academic exercises. Even though I love academic exercises, we need more of those to continue developing the knowledge, but we need to push forward beyond that, especially as scientists keep telling us that we have 10 years to really do substantial changes and then moving forwards.
Yeah, well, this is terrific. I'm very energized about the summer crash course, and I hope that you'll invite your students in that course to join the International Society for Ecological Economics. This is our convening space. Yeah, there's been comments in the chat about if this is the future of ecological economics, we are in good hands, and I could not agree more. I have several more prepared questions. But everyone's heard plenty from me. So would anyone in the audience like to unmute yourselves and pose a question? We can do that, and I'll come back to some of my prepared questions if we have some open time.
Robbie, if I may make a proposal here.
Yes, Madhav.
There are very few students on the call here. Maybe it would be nice to hear from students first.
Students on the call, would you like to react to your peers?
I guess I have more of a comment. It's just refreshing to hear from a bunch of, early career environmental economists or ecological economists. At my university, there's maybe 4 of us in the entire program, and I'm in an earth and environment program. So it's mostly people who are doing bio work and geology work. So it's really nice to feel like a part of the community here and hear your reflections. I'm like Googling all the books that you're talking about and buying them on, I'm like really energized by this. So thanks for just maybe more of a comment. Thanks for having this panel discussion. It's great. I love it.
Yeah, well, thank you for the comment. I really agree. Well, I'm happy to return to some of my prepared questions. So it's no secret that we are, as a planet, confronting some very challenging times. And we sometimes like to think about how we can tie current events to ecological economics, to think about how we can address them. So open to anyone. As we confront inflation, a climate crisis, an ongoing social crisis marked by rising inequality in the US and globally, what is the role of ecological economics in informing a just transition out of these complex biophysical and social dilemmas that confront global humanity? I know that's a big question, especially when we're thinking about concurrent crises. I think we tend to think about a climate policy and a social policy. COVID has really demonstrated to us that these challenges are all connected. Well, let me ask maybe more of a targeted question. Nina, I believe you've co-authored a book chapter where you discuss and advocate for demilitarization to enable the just transition that I just referred to in the question. Could you maybe just begin with maybe elaborating a little bit on what you did with that work?
Sure. So my co-author is Matthew Burke, who is also at UVM right now, and I believe he's now the research associate for this project, for the Leadership for the Ecozoic project. Okay. And essentially, our paper, which should be coming out anytime now, the publishers say, it talks about how the US military is one of the, well, first of all, it is one of the largest oil consumers in the world. And it essentially, in many ways, exists to maintain that capacity to continue to use oil itself and to protect oil supplies and energy supplies, fossil fuel supplies for United States and allies in general, for the continued level of consumerism that like folks in modern societies or like middle class or affluent in those societies are used to. And then there is I think the initial idea that Matt had is to push back against the narrative that the military can be an ally and an effective actor in mobilizing, which is a very military term, a transition to renewable sources of energy. And so the argument, essentially the first part of the paper lays out how that is not feasible at all, and that it is the whole institution that, of the military is geared towards maintaining US hegemony and US top position in the world order as a political nation state in a position of power. And so essentially the contradictions within the military functioning and how it orients US public policy around its own needs, and in a sense warps priorities of United States federal policy, all of that is not going to be, is impossible to overcome for it to be an authentic ally in contributing to a just transition. So we go deep into data and analysis of how the military culture basically affects the United States, and how that situation encourages a similar behavior on the part of other nation states. And so there's constantly an actual conflict rather than incentives in this kind of the political structures of the various actors in the world to cooperate. And so the second part of the paper talks about repurposing the military, essentially retraining the personnel. It's one of the top employers in the United States. I think 4 million people is what we found. And one of the kind kind of tactics of the military is to be everywhere in the United States. So it affects every elected politician's electorate is to have military employment in their districts. And so there's a lot of different details that we go into. So essentially retraining personnel is one of the things we talk about in terms of how to repurpose the military, basically demilitarize and repurpose the assets that are already embodied energy towards actually supporting the ecological aspects and the social equality and justice aspects towards the just transition. So that's that paper, and I can share it happily when it comes in.
Well, I would really like to read it. I mean, I'm very intrigued by the thoughts you just shared, and my thoughts went to the parallel of degrowth. I mean, in an era of escalating militarization, it's hard to imagine a transition to something that would be called demilitarization. And we're on, a global race for economic growth. When we are trying to bring degrowth into a discussion, it has to be there. It has to be part of the discourse. If we're going to take any of these concurrent crises seriously. Shaun, let's turn to you about this question, the very broad, big question about current events and concurrent crises. What are your thoughts on ecological economics?
So I am also, so I see the role of ecological economics as sort of providing a like sense-making narrative to many folks and organizations that are kind of like exasperated with crisis responses. In my own community, starting last year, pardon me, I was asked because I participate in and run a like public discussion series in my community on essentially ecological economics. So that's what people know me for now around town. And an organization that was working on housing solutions sort of came to me and said, hey, we have a housing crisis and a price inflation crisis. My community has 70% price inflation on real estate right now. It's pretty bonkers. And so they said, we're not interested in these market-based solutions. They're also not trying to give them to us. We want to sort of imagine, we want to know what ecological economics says about housing. And that's not my area of expertise, but I had been spending a lot of time with ecological macroeconomics, and I was able to put out messages to the listservs for EE and say, hey, what do we think about housing? What is the ecological macroeconomic perspective on this? And so got to sort of spend time working with this organization and sort of giving them a bit of clarity about what the forms of sort of economic perspectives are that inform the responses that are being offered by the government, to sort of say, yeah, these are the, it's a commodity. It has to be creating profit for a third party. This is what happens when housing is inside of markets and that sort of thing. And being able to say, here's what other potential alternatives are. And that was really empowering for this organization to be able to say, you don't like this, there are other options. And here's this body of literature that exists, and let's work together. And I don't think my work directly led to what their next steps were, but it enabled them to sort of feel a bit more confident in rejecting a number of the market-based solutions that were being offered, and really clarify sort of like alternative provisioning systems and alternatives and how to manage and govern the sort of like space between keeping housing in a market and protecting it from market capture. So I felt that was a moment where I was like, okay, ecological economics, even in something that is not explicitly about ecology, but in the macro sense is about sort of like creating an alternative future and sort of like shifting the ways in which, pardon me, the ways in which sort of like we imagine market futures. Sorry. Yeah, I could go on, but I guess, yeah, so that's just to speak from experience.
Well, someone posted in the chat a link to an interview on NPR, on Vermont Public Radio. I think there'll be, you may be interested to hear a little bit about Joe's work on housing, if that's of interest to you.
Definitely. Thank you, Joe.
Well, we can pivot a little bit. Laura Schmidt-Olabisi is the president of USSEE currently, and she's in the room. And she has noted all three panelists have touched on the relationship between scholarship and activism. You must know that the old school model is the unbiased scientist who just is objective and looks at evidence and shies away from activism. So Laura says, I would love to hear how each of them speak, hear each of them speak about how they navigate that relationship between scholarship and activism in your own work. And I would open it to anyone who would like to begin.
I guess I could go. I've been, 10 years ago, 2012, Bill McCammon came to Syracuse University to talk about the divestment movement. And I went to his talk, and from that moment on, we started organizing SUNY SF at Syracuse University to divest. And we ended up helping to divest in 2015, both institutions. So I've been involved in organizing and activist work for like 10 years, more than 10 years, I guess, going to protesting and all kinds of things that really reinvigorate who I am as a person, as a human being who shares all of this, who cares about, I guess. When you are an activist, I believe, is because you care deeply about people and on whatever your cause is. But I think the way I see it is we have to be hybrids, especially if you're in academia. I think nowadays, especially many of the young people coming out, emerging scholars, they are many, whether they realize it or not, they are hybrids, or they are trying to be hybrids in which you can be an activist, you can wear the hat of an activist or an academic or a practitioner or whatever it is. You don't have to be in a silo of any kind, and that's what's freeing about this what we're in. I understand not everyone can do that or feels comfortable doing that, but it's something that I work towards. And even the Ecological Economics for All initiative is a hybrid of like how you pushing forward academically, but also as an activist. And Donella Meadows in 1992 in the Beyond Limits book that they wrote 30 years ago, she came out with 5 tools for a sustainability transition, she called it, in which she called us to have a vision, to tell the truth, to network, to learn, and to love each other, basically. And I added to collaborate. But she was spot on then, and that's exactly what we need to be doing today. And also part of that book was something that really drives the way I think now, is that they wrote, a sustainable society is one that can persist over generations, one that is far-seeing enough, flexible enough, and wise enough not to undermine either its physical or social systems of support. So Donella Meadows herself was very much a hybrid. And I now that I have learned so much about her, I draw a lot of inspiration from her, and also obviously from John and Josh, who in their own ways are also hybrids, I believe. I don't know if they want to classify themselves as that, but I think they are. And she literally tried to bridge the gap between academics, activists, and practitioners. And she was always pushing forward, almost very, very, very special and very different than everyone else. And I think we have to follow her lead and that of others who have come before us.
Excellent points. I mean, if you think about beyond even Danelle Meadows, Rachel Carson and E.O. Wilson and Sylvia Earle and so many of the world's best known scientists advocated. So I'm glad to hear how you've approached this, navigating that relationship. Anyone else want to comment?
I have a couple thoughts I'd like to share. So for a couple of, like something that you said, Robbie, in terms of like the traditional model of an objective research scientist, observing and analyzing, and the assumption that the researcher does not affect the actual research is now certainly being looked at critically. And one of the things that I mentioned is one of my research interests is participatory action research methods, which quite largely like calls into question traditional research methods and approaches, and how people who are being studied are treated and related to. And so this also relates, I think, to one of the components of the mission of leadership for the Ecozoic in terms of transforming academia and in essence decolonizing academia and bringing in criticality to the research practices themselves and shifting towards less harmful, less extractive, I mean ideally non-extractive ways of co-creating knowledge and co-creating solutions to problems. And that certainly includes how problems are even framed in the first place and who gets to ask the questions and who gets to design the research in the first place. And I think that also all relates to the leadership component of the Leadership for the Ecozoic project, where one of the many kind of things that participants in L4E and hopefully our various collaborators are learning is what it means to be a leader for the Ecozoic, what that actually means, and flipping maybe traditional notions and understandings of leadership and how those are operationalized and how people experience somebody's leadership. And so in general, given that overall academia is in many ways like a white supremacist institution in the first place. And so deconditioning supremacy modes or deconditioning like power over dominating modes of leadership from practitioners who are seeking to be like myself, a leader in a certain way, or a contributor is how I like to call it, to the Ecozoic. So learning like basically a lot of what being humble in service to leadership towards the Ecozoic might mean, and how to, I'm gonna try to bring this all together, and like how to move forward as a participatory action researcher without replicating traditional research methods that have quite a long history of harm and extractiveness, and then erasure of actual other people's knowledge and other people's credit that's due to them for that knowledge.
Wow, that's great. Your reference to participatory action research, I'm sure, will resonate with Laura, who asked the question. Her expertise is in participatory research, specifically system dynamics modeling. And I think she brings that kind of same perspective to the work she does. Shaun, if I could turn to you, John Erickson has posted a question in the chat. Herman Daly has gotten a lot of slack from the mainstream for his views on capital mobility and comparative, or lack thereof, advantage. This seems like an important debate that has emerged from ecological economics. What are your thoughts on that critique?
Yeah, I definitely agree with Daly that so the primary assumption of comparative advantage from 1817 is the immobility of capital to cross borders, or actually the only mobility is goods. Labor and capital are supposed to sort of stay put, and then you can establish a comparative advantage. And if you have capital mobility, then capital flows wherever it wants to, and then theoretically that should make it so you have only absolute advantage operating. And that's what Daly regularly sort of talked about. And I agree. I mean, I think that that's what unequal exchange is also studying. I think that that's what, or ecological unequal exchange is also sort of just making a rigorous empirical case for absolute advantage. I think in many ways, some of the reasons that comparative advantage has remained in the public discourse for so long is because it has a really sort of concealing function socially to sort of make us think that we have comparative advantage and that this sort of like absolute extractivism is not what's really happening. One of the places, so some of the debates that are around this sort of illuminating the difference between absolute and comparative advantage sort of suggest that we should go back, that we should put in place capital controls, and then we can reap the benefits of comparative advantage. The issue with that is that comparative advantage is a growth model. It is intended to create scale growth of the economy. It's intended to increase throughput. And the very simple theory of it is, you know, it works. It's a lovely theory. But I think that the issue is that we are not, as ecological economists, generally trying to figure out how to get more growth right now, especially in goods and throughput. So I think that, so my own research definitely engages with, or starts from a point that says comparative advantage is great, we don't have it, and we shouldn't be trying to have it, that isn't the answer because we are not trying to grow all of our economies. And so I think, now that said, I don't see people really talking a lot about comparative advantage right now. I think the last time that I heard Daly advocate for it was in an article in the late 90s, but I could be wrong. So I think, I mean, also the sort of forms of capital controls that existed in the Bretton Woods era, in the post-World War II, where we had some capital controls, you know, they correlate with some sort of like better social outcomes. But it's not clear to me that those are anything more than correlations necessarily. That said, I definitely believe in capital controls. But I also think that capital controls need to include a sense of the incommensurability of capitals and of value, that when we think about capital controls at the international trade level, that it's not just about moving finances across borders, that actually if we think about it as the sort of triple pathway of moving the incommensurable values across borders, and in terms of control, who gets that control? Is that participatory governance, et cetera? Those are interesting questions to me. That's stuff that I find is emerging from my own research, and are, I think, absolutely critical to, I mean, it's a foundational principle of ecological economics, the idea that these capitals are not interchangeable infinitely. So I think that's actually exactly one of the things that I think is ecological economics has already all these ideas sort of here in order to sort of help figure out a lot of the problems we're working with. But
yeah, thank you. Great answer. Thanks, John, for the question. Let's turn to Rigo. Jeff has posted a question in the text directed to Rigo. I understand that one of the serious concerns with carbon capture and storage is the energy and other costs associated with it are such that it reduces energy return on energy invested in most cases so much as to be biophysically and hence economically not viable, especially on a wide scale. This seems especially true as overall EROI is in steady decline for fossil fuels. What can you tell us about this? It seems important given how much countries like Canada are relying on carbon capture and storage to increasing oil and gas production. In Canada, this is happening in the Trans Mountain Pipeline, which is meant to handle increased flows of oil sands bitumen, and the newly approved Bay du Nord in the deep sea oil project off Newfoundland as several examples. So yeah, what can you tell us about, given declining energy return on energy investment, what's the viability of carbon capture?
So not an easy question, but what I can say is I can take the question a little bit a different way. And I've been reading a lot about the economic superorganism. I'm learning a lot from John Gowdy's book on sociality and Lizzie Kroll's upcoming book on bitter harvest, in which they have been working for the past 10 years, understanding this co-evolving economic superorganism from the transition to hunter-gathering to agriculture, and now its latest iteration through capitalism, industrial financial capitalism. And basically, the system, right, carbon capture and sequestration is just an example of us seeking complexity, right? Human civilization throughout history has been, since that transition that jump-started this economic superorganism from hunter-gathering to agriculture, has been looking for this complexity. And complexity is basically defined as human developing problem-solving tools. Sometimes people are like, what the hell are you talking about when you say complexity? It's problem-solving tools. And technologies such as carbon capture and sequestration is one of them, in which we're trying to continue the system, right? We're trying to put band-aids almost, like say, we can continue burning. Canada's economy is heavily dependent on tar sands and on selling that, on developing the size of Florida. Last time I heard in Alberta, which is a massive ecological disaster. Well, they also talk about how good they are for the environment and the international community, but then, the climate impacts from their development are impacting the poorest around the world. So, and then when it comes to the energy return on investment, there's been a paper recently which I share with Jeff, called Comparative Net Analysis of Renewable Electricity and Carbon Capture and Storage by I think his name is pronounced Sigurilis. Maybe I'm butchering his name here, but I can share with you guys. And basically, these people, some of them students of Charlie Hall, did an analysis comparing of the ROI of renewable energy. So investing in two options: invest in renewable energy to get out of the fossil fuel problem, or double down on fossil fuels and hope for the best with carbon capture and sequestration. And they show that, the energy return investment of carbon capture and sequestration was too low. It will become too low compared to renewable energy. So the recommendation was almost like you're better off actually investing in renewable energy. And that's when tools such as ROI become really handy, right? And because you want to know how much energy you're getting of your investment. And there are a lot of problems, and they're still trying to develop the technology. Is still, in early stages, and we'll see what happens in the future. But we need a transformation of the economic system, and the sooner people figure this out, especially politicians, whoever is making the decisions, the better we'll be off. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I guess part of that challenge is made more difficult by the infrastructure needed for renewable energy, often which requires high heat temperature, and it's very difficult to produce high heat temperature without fossil fuels. But maybe that's a whole discussion in and of itself. Let me pause. We have, about 10 minutes left. Let me pause again and ask if any audience, any participants in the meeting would like to unmute themselves and react to anything you've heard or pose an additional question. Chris.
Yeah, I'm curious, like, what role you see ecological economics playing in larger global changes, whether you see it as a sort of research arm that's developing ideas that'll then trickle into larger forums and become more mainstream, or that there's a urge or a desire for ecological economics to become the mainstream and be a huge focus and expand out its influence directly, I guess.
Who'd like to take that? Go ahead, Shaun.
I'm happy to speak a little bit to that. So I often joke, but not joking, and say that if we survive the next 50 years, ecological economics will just be called economics. But I also sort of firmly believe that the reasons that mainstream like economic lenses remain in such a central position is not just because they think they're right. It's also because they support a power structure in a reinforcing feedback loop that makes a lot of people that supports the forms of capital accumulation that we currently have. So I don't see ecological economics ending up in some sort of central power position, because I don't think we're trying to make capital accumulation easier for any single group of people. So I think that there are power reasons that EE won't be top dog yet, or that will just be sort of part of a plural landscape for a while. But I also find that more and more, from my position as a young researcher, that it seems to me that there is more and more interest in what ecological economics research is providing and what kind of whole system perspective is attached to that research. So and that's been a much faster process than I even thought. I mean, even in Europe, there's so like the Paris Accords excluded transportation costs from any of the sort of like any of the international trade that was going to be part of that agreement, because they were doing production-based accounting then. But now there's been this massive shift in Europe. I'm speaking a little bit out of my total expert, but my impression is that there are a number of European countries that are using consumption-based accounting now, and that happened really fast and is now considered the norm. Does that mean that EE is now like the central economic advisors? I don't think so, but I think that it'll be a much more iterative process and a bit subtler. And I would be interested in what Rigo or Nina had to say about that too.
Well, before we move on, Chris and Joe have posted in the chat that evidently the ecological economics program at University of Leeds is larger than the economics program. So maybe we are winning. Nina, Rigo, would either of you like to react to Chris's question?
Go.
Okay, thanks. I can just add a few things. First of all, Shaun, I love that joke. That is brilliant. I generally agree. I think, I mean, one of the things I was writing has been part of my writing is to say that in a sense, right now it is a power struggle between orthodox classical and neoclassical economists who are just, just enamored and don't want to give up the delusion of infinite growth. So it's power struggle with that with ecological economists. And then, there are many different ways for like infiltrating. Some of it can be covert in terms of like tailoring what, like has already been mentioned, how we speak, in what spaces. That's one thing. And I think that can be a helpful strategy is we don't have to call it ecological economics. In fact, Gund Institute changed its name from ecological economics to the environment. I believe in part, I don't know exactly for sure, there's more conversation about this. I know this is quite a large discussion about that, but I believe in part because ecological economics seems fringe, and environment is a more broadly acceptable term. Like, yes, of course, we probably, more people could get behind more easily the fact that humanity needs to really address its environmental issues. And so, so there's that side, is that the ecological economics can be happening without that label. And it's just really important for researchers and practitioners and writers and activists to be really clear about what we're doing and how we're doing it, and and to stay in alignment with the principles and the values, and ensuring, like, monitoring and ensuring the outcomes that are in alignment. In terms of what's going on in Europe too, I do want to say that degrowth it can be framed as like a praxis of ecological economics. This is, how we need to literally degrow and then have like a more of a circular economy. It's not going to, this is writ large, and it's not, degrowth is not appropriate for every place on the planet. Just want to make sure that I'm clear about where I'm coming from with that. But there continues to be a lot of interest and a lot of activism and education in Europe, especially around that. And I'm happy to share in yet another large festival and gathering and educational event that's going to be happening in August to support and educate and have degrowth be more of an enacted practice. And again, there with language too, it can be really helpful to not be so attached to the language and the term, and be really strategic about how we talk in what spaces about what and what is actually happening on the ground empirically.
Well, we probably don't have time to take another question, but Rigo, would you like to respond to what Chris has raised in one or 2 minutes?
I really like that question by Chris. In a way, the Ecological Economics for All initiative is kind of like working towards, I don't know if you want to call it mainstreaming, but just basically saying this is how the economy works, right? And drawing a lot from Robke's paper, Econ 101. That's how we've been structuring the website. Basically, just tell people, don't go right away after attacking neoclassical economics with these problems, many problems, but just tell people how the economy works. Tell them about the biophysical foundation, the social foundation, and then from then you can start, discussing how you can address the inequalities and the climate crisis that we confront. But yeah, I was just also going to mention, in line with what Nina was saying about degrowth, the recent IPCC report talked about degrowth, and I think that there's a beginning when you start seeing that even scientists, these are things that are issued by scientists, and they are saying, we have to look at alternatives besides just ending economic growth. And as we continue to face limits to growth, 50 years later, we have not paid attention to it because we have perceived this abundance of fossil fuels that have allowed us to ignore and to continue this duality between humans and the rest of nature. That is a false duality, because we are nature. And I think that as we continue to confront issues of inflation, which are just basically increasing costs from that will, like I said, be exacerbated with climate change. They already have been. The United States has to spend more than $2 trillion in 1980 on climate disasters, related disasters. So we have what's important to get here is that ecological economics, like I said, has a very important story to tell. We have to learn how to tell it in a way that is welcoming to people from all backgrounds. You know, the course that we're having in July, it has an overwhelming number of economic undergraduate, graduate students, academics, activists. Like, I really wanted it to be for all, and we have private sector, even some politicians in it. But the fact that we have most of these people from economic background means that they are craving for these kind of alternatives, because they see it. It's very, very obvious to see what's happening. You know, it's not that we cannot even see it anymore. We're seeing it everywhere. So people are like, what do we do? Definitely the system that we have today, market-based, just market-based. I'm not saying that markets are not good. There are some good aspects of markets, but just focusing on free market solutions is not gonna get us to fix the problem. You know, just to give you one last example, the United States, the last time the United States tried to do a major climate policy was in 2009, when Pelosi passed the cap and trade bill in the House, which ultimately didn't end up being passed in the Senate. But that is a market-based solution. And the United States couldn't even do a market-based solution. And now 10 years later, we are running out of time. We need transformational solutions.
Well, we probably need to close there, but thank you all for commenting on that. And on behalf of the board of the United States Society for Ecological Economics, let me thank you, all three, for just an excellent panel. I think we're all inspired by the future of ecological economics, as articulated so well by the three of you. Know that I see several former USSEE board members, and I've counted 4 current or former USSEE presidents in this session today. You're speaking to the leaders of USSEE and ecological economics, and I fully hope to see your names on the board of CANSI and USSEE in the future. Let me ask everyone to join me in a virtual or in real life applause to thank our panelists. You did excellent, and I'm thankful for you. Please stick around, everyone. We're going to start right now with a conversation with Nate Higgins, including a screening of his short film, The Great Simplification. But for now, thank you, panelists, and everyone, please stick around.
Awesome. Thank you, Robbie. And thank you to all those panelists.